Welcome everybody. My name is Emanuel Rota. I am the director of the European Union Center, and we are very happy for today's event, which is part of this series of events we have been organizing on the historical perspective of contagion and helping ourselves and our friends and members of the community and of the university to have a better understanding of the current situation through, again, a historical perspective and other moments in history where people had to face the question of contagion and the question of protecting themselves. The first three lectures, as you know, focus mostly on the Middle Ages, whereas today we are going to move decisively in the direction of modernity, between early modernity and late modernity. And as always, I would like to thank the European Union Center team for organizing with me this event, Jonathan Larson, our associate director, Sydney Lazarus, who is our outreach coordinator, who has been also recording all these fantastic lectures, which are available on the European Union Center website. So if you have friends or family members, or if you miss part of it, or if you are interested in listening to presentations again, perhaps as teaching material for future classes or so on and so forth, please do not hesitate to go to the European Union Center website and look at the presentations again. We have also been working with our fantastic research assistants in putting together study guides and bibliographies on these. And these are also available on the European Union Center website. So there you can also find more information and potentially more reading material that might be useful for the next class. Before I move forward and I introduce today's speaker, I just want to mention that this is not our last event. This is our next to last event. It's we're very proud of the entire series, but we thought that perhaps the very last event should be focusing on the present. And so we have been working on creating a panel on the theme of what's going to happen next, particularly with the focus on what's happening in education and what's happening here on campus and with our university. And so we have assembled a panel of interesting speakers who are going to present next Thursday, and more information will be sent through the appropriate channels. But we'll have the CEO of the Irish branch of a multinational pharmaceutical corporation that are working on potentially finding a vaccine, who is going to talk about how long it's going to take as soon as a vaccine is found, assuming that a vaccine is found, to produce and distribute the vaccine. So we're going to have a sort of industry perspective on the question of next Thursday, yes, on the perspective of the vaccine. Second, we'll have from the Department of Engineering here on campus, we'll have one of our fantastic engineers who is working with a team of graduate students on developing an app that could be used on campus to monitor and record and discuss the presence of the virus, or how to monitor the presence of the virus on campus. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions about privacy and about what that implies in terms of policing the community or self-policing the community, and the implication for our lives, but I'm sure that our fantastic speaker Sanjay Patel will be able to answer all that question. And finally, Linda Herrera, who has been working in Egypt with the Ministry of Education to put students online, who is going to talk about the experience of teaching online in Egypt as an alternative experience, and what Egypt has been doing to continue the education process in these difficult times. Again, more information about this is coming down the information channel, so stay tuned for our next and last panel of the series. But I already wasted too much of your precious time because you are here, of course, to listen to our fantastic colleague, David O'Brien, who, of course, is a French art historian who specializes in the 18th and 19th century. I assume that his talk today is going to be based partially or mostly on his first book, which focuses on the question of revolution and propaganda under Napoleon. So very appropriate theme. But David O'Brien is also more recently the author of a great book on one of my favorite artists, Eugène Delacroix, and his second book titled Exile in Modernity, Delacroix, Civilization and Barbarism, a book that I had the pleasure to read while it was written, and I strongly recommend to anybody who has any interest in the history of modernity or the history of art. So we are fortunate enough to have David O'Brien here, giving us this talk titled Plague, Politics, and Napoleonic Propaganda around the beginning of the 19th century, around 1800. And without much further ado, I give you David O'Brien. Please keep in mind that at the end of the presentation, as we always do, David has accepted to answer questions. Please submit your questions online through the chat, and I will read them. So take the time to please submit questions, and I'm happy to refer them to David O'Brien. Thank you so much, David. The floor is yours. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. Thanks for inviting me, first of all, and also thanks to Sydney Lazarus for organizing everything. The only thing I've had to do is show up here, so that's very nice. And I'm thrilled to be speaking in the same series as Carol Symes and Nora Stupino. I have enjoyed all the lectures in this series, and I'm just hoping that I can live up to their high level. So my presentation focuses on an epidemic of the plague that broke out in the French army in 1799. It wasn't a pandemic, so it's not like the one that Carol and Nora discussed. It was a relatively small epidemic that broke out in Egypt and Syria, and it killed around 2,000 French soldiers and an uncounted number of local people. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a new epidemic of the plague visited Egypt every 9 years or so, so there was nothing very extraordinary about this one. The episode is interesting because of the ways in which it was represented by Napoleon Bonaparte and his propagandists, both at the moment of the epidemic and after he returned to France. Most famously, Bonaparte commissioned this painting by Antoine Jean Gros in 1804. It represents the plague in ways that are especially interesting today, I think, because we are unfortunately now quite familiar with the fears raised by contagion. The French encounter with the plague in Egypt shares very little in detail with the coronavirus pandemic, but it illuminates, or at least it's my argument that it illuminates, some of the ways that disease can intersect with politics. On the level of political representation, there are some interesting, if speculative, connections to be made to our own situation. I want to spend the bulk of my time with the painting, but I first want to situate the event it depicts within Bonaparte's career and within the Egyptian expedition, with which I assume most of you are not familiar. So I'm going to be talking about Bonaparte's early career, and just to sketch that in, at the age of 26, at the very young age of 26, he was put in charge of the army of Italy. France was losing badly in the revolutionary wars in Italy. Bonaparte takes over at 26 and conquers most of Italy for the French Republic. After that, he goes on what we're going to be focusing on, the Egyptian expedition. He brings an army down to Egypt. But immediately after the Egyptian expedition, he stages a coup d'etat back in France, and he becomes first consul of a government that's called the consulate. He becomes the leader of France. And then in 1804, he becomes emperor of France. He has, of course, quite a career after this. He rules for 11 more years as emperor, but I'll be skipping all of that. I'm really just focusing on these two periods here, 1798-99. We'll see how Bonaparte represented the plague in this period, and then 1804 when he revisits this episode. So just to say a few words about the Egyptian expedition, it's a good question. Why in the world did Bonaparte go down to Egypt during the revolution? There are a few answers. I mean, there had been some thought of invading England, and Bonaparte had been involved with those plans. That proved to be impossible. So going down to Egypt was in a way striking at England because there were important British trade routes through Egypt. It was also a way for the Directory, for the government in France, to get rid of Bonaparte. They knew he had designs on power. So there were many who were not unhappy to see him go down to Egypt, and there were probably more than a few who were hoping he wasn't going to come back. But it was mainly a publicity stunt. Bonaparte knew that a victory in Egypt could move people's imaginations like not much else. So at any rate, he leaves France with an army of 35,000 troops from Toulon, that's right here. And he sails down to Egypt. He stops briefly in Malta, claims Malta for the French Republic. And he lands just outside of Alexandria on the 1st of July, 1798. So I'm just going to run through this very briefly. There are quite a few battles that we're going to skip over. They're not important for our purposes. But Bonaparte quickly moves to Cairo. And in Cairo, a number of things happen. He takes Cairo on the 24th of July. On the 1st of August, his fleet is destroyed. The boats that took him to Egypt are destroyed by Admiral Nelson, and he has no way to get his army back to France. He sends an army after the remnants of the Ottoman forces. There's the leader of the Ottomans, his name is Murad Bey. He sends one army down in this direction. But in Cairo, an insurrection breaks out. Bonaparte thought he was going to be welcomed in Egypt as a liberator. He told them he was bringing the revolution to Egypt, also told the Egyptians that he was a Muslim. Things didn't work out like he expected, and he found himself with urban guerrilla warfare going on. So he's trapped in Cairo. He has problems with urban insurrection, but he also knows there's an Ottoman force coming down from the north. So he takes an army up in this direction. And I want to just say a few things about that. So here we are coming out of Egypt, and here's what they called Syria at the time, modern day Israel. In Gaza. So let's see, he has, there are a number of battles that we will skip moving up here, but in Jaffa, this is key for us. There are three things that happen in Jaffa. One, he has to take the town by siege. This is the town of Jaffa today, but the walls are something of the same as they were when Bonaparte surrounded it. He takes it by siege, And the conditions of this campaign were brutal. He had long marches without food or water. When he takes the town, there is extraordinary rape, pillage, murder. In the 18th century, sadly, rape, pillage, murder, those were to be expected after a siege. If you didn't surrender in a siege, that was the price you paid. But what happened in Jaffa was reportedly far worse than the ordinary. It seems that every household was invaded. Not only were women and girls raped, but many of them were murdered as well. It was just a brutal follow-up to the siege. So there's that. Then there had been some soldiers holed up in the citadel, and to get them to surrender, Bonaparte promised to spare their lives. They surrendered. There were between 2,500 and 3,000 of them. They surrendered. Bonaparte had them bayoneted on the beach. They were bayoneted in order to save gunpowder for the muskets. So that was another horrendous thing that happened in Jaffa. And finally, the plague broke out in Jaffa. In fact, it had broken out earlier in the campaign. I'll come back to that, but we'll return to that in a moment. So the campaign continues, and he goes as far north as this town here called Acre, or today called Akka. And there's another siege here, and the siege lasts from the 19th of March to the 10th of May. Bonaparte's unable to take the town. It's actually his first loss, his first military loss in his entire career, and he won't have another loss until 1812 in Russia. And it's kind of interesting that this gets forgotten, that Bonaparte's first major loss was in Syria. At any rate, he's forced to retreat, and he comes back to Jaffa. There's another bad event that happens in Jaffa. He poisons some of his own soldiers who can't follow the retreat. And then there's a hasty retreat back to Cairo. On the 23rd of August, Bonaparte leaves for France. He takes a small, fast boat with a few other generals and many of the intellectuals and artists who accompanied him. So he takes just a small coterie of his closest associates and people who can represent this campaign when he gets back to France. So I just want to point out a few things. So he left with 13,000 French soldiers for that march north. He returned with 8,000. So that it was a terrible campaign. Then he leaves for France. I've emphasized that. So two things we have to hold on to for what I'm going to talk about here. The Egyptian expedition was a gross military failure. It was a complete defeat. That somehow gets forgotten in histories of Napoleon. And we might think that Bonaparte would want to forget this, but just the opposite happens. He transforms this whole episode into a tremendous victory back in France, not a military victory, but a huge gain for the arts and for scholarship. And in fact, there are many famous works of scholarship and works of art that come out of this. There's the Description de l'Égypte, which is a kind of encyclopedia, just this lavish 26-volume encyclopedia. We actually have a second edition of it in our library here at Illinois. But the volumes they're about 3 feet tall and just are lavishly illustrated with engravings like you see here. There are many other books as well. This is an illustration for Vivant Tenon's Voyage dans la Basse et la Haute Égypte, another book written about the expedition. And in the arts, the effect of the expedition is enormous. It's often referred to as Egyptomania and celebrated as just a glorious moment in the arts. But all of this stands on top of a pretty grim reality of military defeat, and we'll come back to that. So finally, before I turn to the painting, I just want to say a couple of things about the plague. If you've been following this series of lectures, you actually know all this already, but the plague, or the Black Death, is caused by a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. And the way that the plague manifests itself, the form it takes, depends on how you catch it, how it's communicated. So we're going to be talking about bubonic plague, so called bubonic plague because you get these bubbos, or these swellings on your skin. Bubonic plague is caused by getting the bacteria through fleas. And those fleas usually come from rats or from rodents, but they can be communicated from humans also. If you get the plague that way, you get these swellings like you see in these. They're actually swellings of the lymph nodes. So they're usually in the underarms or in the neck or in the groin. There had been plague in Alexandria since the beginning of 1798, and it broke out in the French army in December of 1798. And by January of 1799, it had killed 95 Frenchmen, despite efforts to quarantine. During the entire campaign, it may have killed as many as 2,000 French soldiers. It wasn't confined to the French, but it does seem to have killed a disproportionate number of them, perhaps because of lack of immunity, but for other reasons that I'll discuss shortly. Bonaparte's own attitude towards the disease is at the core of what I want to talk about today. He initially denied that the disease was the plague, and insisted that it be referred to only as the fever. He also made a very strange claim. He asserted that the disease was only contagious if you feared it. Similarly, he said that moral courage, that was his word, moral courage, would prevent one from catching the disease. Of course, the doctors in Bonaparte's army recognized immediately that they were dealing with the plague, and Bonaparte eventually acknowledged this too. There was still no cure for the plague, so doctors responded primarily by quarantining the sick. Bonaparte applied the death penalty to those who broke quarantine. He also ordered sick men stripped, bathed in the sea, and their clothes washed. And yet he persisted publicly with a response that was willfully ignorant, proclaiming that the plague was contagious only for those who feared it. Presumably, he thought that this would raise the morale of the army. Bonaparte's attitude towards the disease is further revealed by a curious anecdote about a surgeon who refused to treat plague victims. Bonaparte ordered him, this is a quotation from a diary from the campaign. Bonaparte ordered him, quote, dressed in women's clothes and led on a donkey through the streets of Alexandria with a sign on his back reading, quote, unworthy of being a French citizen, he is afraid of dying. The use of women's clothing suggests his response to the disease was informed by ideals of masculinity, that for Bonaparte, the surgeon's fear rendered him like a woman. Bonaparte's emphasis on moral courage in the face of the disease, on the other hand, surely connoted manliness. I find it fascinating that COVID-19 has elicited similar reactions. For example, the televangelist Jonathan Shuttlesworth denigrated some of his fellow pastors for distributing hand sanitizer and canceling services, calling them, quote, a bunch of pansies with no balls who got neutered somewhere along the line and don't even realize it. Shuttlesworth is just one extremist who shouldn't be taken seriously. Something of the same masculinist attitude sometimes informs the mockery of people for wearing face masks. And perhaps it can also be seen in the desire to refer to the pandemic as, quote, our big war, or a war, quote, to defeat the Chinese virus. The metaphor of war has been insisted upon despite the fact that pacific virtues such as social solidarity, community support, and transnational cooperation would seem to be far more necessary to eliminate the disease. The plague erupted with renewed virulence during Bonaparte's invasion of Syria, in part because of the extreme conditions in which it took place. Long forced marches and frequent battles led to poor food and water supplies and a total lack of hygiene. But the main exacerbating factor may have been that quarantine was difficult to enforce during the marches and the retreat. Perhaps also the fleas on the thousands of corpses Bonaparte left in his wake found new hosts in some of the French soldiers. Plague was especially a problem in Jaffa, where 700 to 800 soldiers died from it. A makeshift hospital had to be set up in an Armenian monastery, and I'm showing you that monastery here. Interestingly, in Jaffa, Bonaparte returned to the idea that fear made one more susceptible to the disease, and he made a special show of not being afraid himself. He spent one morning doing administrative work in the hospital, and according to one very credible account, he, quote, helped to lift, or rather to carry, the hideous corpse of a soldier whose torn uniform was spoiled by the spontaneous bursting of an enormous abscessed bubo. When he returned to Jaffa during his hasty retreat from Acre to Cairo, he continued to suggest he was unafraid of the disease, but his attitude was different. There is one report of him walking hastily through the hospital, tapping his boot with his riding crop, but there were apparently no more displays of compassion for the sick. The most fateful decision he made at this time was to have poison administered to those soldiers too sick with the plague to follow his retreat. 30 to 60 soldiers were given a lethal dose of laudanum. While the rape and pillage after the siege and the execution of prisoners of war might have been excused by many back in France, poisoning his own soldiers was clearly beyond the pale. As it happened, several soldiers survived the ordeal and told their tale to the British after being taken prisoner. The British press had a field day with the story, as can be seen in this print. So here's Bonaparte in the middle here, and the head doctor, a man called Desgenet, refused to administer the poison, and it was this man, a man called Royer, he was a pharmacist actually, who gave the poison to the soldiers, whom we see over here. So now I want to skip ahead 5 years to when the painting was completed and exhibited. This occurred in a very different political context after Bonaparte had been in power for over 4 years. Just to give you a sense of how rapidly his image was changing, I'm going to show you these 3 paintings. So here he is as a revolutionary general in 1796. Here he is as first consul in 1801. And here he is as emperor in 1805. So that just to give you a sense of the pace with which his image is changing. Gros' painting came at a moment when Bonaparte was consolidating his dictatorial and monarchical powers. The enormous size of the picture, it's over 7 meters wide, and its exhibition at the Salon, that is at an enormous biennial exhibition at the very center of public life in Paris, ensured that the painting would receive maximal attention. Bonaparte's decision to commission a painting that harkened back to one of the most dismal moments in his career demands some explanation. Why return to the scene of some of his most unspeakable crimes? Equally curious was Gros' decision to draw attention to Bonaparte's odd response to the disease. That is, his insistence that moral courage rendered the disease non-communicable. Gros' initial impulse was to depict the episode recounted earlier when Bonaparte helped carry the body of a plague-stricken soldier. This arrangement had some obvious shortcomings. The cramped setting did not offer the same opportunities to exploit the exotic locale of the event, and the image of the general awkwardly supporting a cadaver lacked the decorum appropriate to Bonaparte's imperial pretensions in 1804. For the final painting, Gros seems to have invented, perhaps in consultation with Bonaparte or one of his advisors, a new narrative. Gro's explanation of the painting in the exhibition catalog reads as follows. This is a quote, "To further distance the frightening idea of a sudden and incurable contagion, Napoleon had opened before him some pestilential tumors and touched several. He gave, by this magnanimous devotion, the first example of a genre of courage unknown until then, and which has since had its imitators." That's the end of the quotation. The painting locates Bonaparte's heroism precisely in his courage to confront the disease physically and thereby mitigate people's fears about it. I think we're in a special position to appreciate this aspect of the painting today. But before turning to this, I want to first summarize some of what we know about the painting's purposes. Much of the older literature on the painting focuses on its relation to Bonaparte's monarchical ambitions and his efforts to cover up his crimes in Jaffa. So, for example, Bonaparte's gesture has been compared to that of French kings who could heal the sick with their touch. So this is Louis XIV, and he's curing a man with scrofula by touching him. And this is Francis I, or Francois Ier, doing the same thing. He's actually healing a woman, you see here, by touching her face. The gesture was no doubt also meant to recall the actions of any number of healing saints and even Christ's healing powers. So this is a painting of Saint Roch healing a plague-stricken man. Saint Roch again. And this is St. Carlo Borromeo, a very popular saint who administered communion to the sick. And here's Christ healing a blind man. Bonaparte also strikes the exact pose of the Apollo Belvedere, then the most famous statue in all of European art history. Apollo was, among other things, the god of medicine, and he supposedly saved Athenians from the plague during the Peloponnesian Wars. Such allusions were no doubt meant to suggest that Bonaparte not only had a healing role in relation to the plague, but that he was the healer and the monarch to help France emerge out of 15 years of civil war. The painting completely whitewashed the poisoning of the plague-stricken, but the painting's work in relation to Bonaparte's crimes was far more sophisticated than a simple denial. If Bonaparte had wanted people to forget about his misdeeds, he would have been better off not talking about Jaffa at all. Instead, the painting admitted that horrific suffering took place during the Egyptian expedition, but it linked these to the Oriental setting and the effects of the disease. One of the most striking contrasts that the painting draws is between the healthy Bonaparte and the sick men who populate the edges of the room. The figures closer to Bonaparte are better illuminated and seem more alive, while those farther away languish in the shadows. It is almost as if Bonaparte's presence brings those close to him alive or to life. A further contrast is drawn between the dress of Bonaparte and the undress of the sick soldiers. He is pristine, impeccably uniformed, and completely vital, while they are naked, unkempt, and diseased. Bonaparte's French identity, as his perfectly kept uniform indicates, remains completely secure in the face of the plague and his Oriental surroundings, while his sick soldiers, particularly because of the way they wear the remnants of their uniforms, appear vaguely Oriental, Oriental being the term Europeans use to designate people from North Africa and the Near East. So this is perhaps not self-evident when you first look at the painting, but these are all French soldiers around here who have succumbed to the plague. There are, of course, Near Easterners in the picture, and of course their exoticism is exploited, but they are not really the binary opposite. They're not what you'd expect, with a normal Saidian reading of Orientalism. The real opposite of Bonaparte are his own soldiers with the plague here. In addition to the disease, there is the exotic architecture, the stunning citadel with a French flag flying over it, the colorful dress of the Ottoman attendants, and even a camel down in here. The painting allowed viewers to explore the horrors of the disease and the exoticness of the Orient, but it substituted these for the facts of military defeat and poisoning. It acknowledged horrible things took place, but even as it admitted to a certain amount of suffering, it displaced attention from the most damning aspects of the expedition. So this is a bit of an aside, but perhaps there is something about dangerous infectious disease that unleashes our most irrational selves. With COVID-19, we have seen how discussions of the disease quickly migrate from questions of public health and medicine to other issues. It seems impossible to separate COVID-19 from politics, in part because the disease raises questions that must be solved politically. How long to maintain social distancing, who to compensate for losses, how best to deal with the disease. And yet discussions of the disease seem especially prone to conspiratorial or even fantastic theories. At various moments, the disease has been represented as a democratic hoax, a virus designed by the Chinese or by Bill Gates, a deep state plot to destroy the economy and influence the presidential election in November, or part of a larger plan to eliminate constitutional liberties. I leave it to my listeners to decide which of these theories is unsound, but it seems undeniable that the fears unleashed by contagion incline at least some of us towards irrationality. Bonaparte and his propagandists seem to have appreciated this power of disease over our imagination, or how it could be amplified by an Oriental setting. If today questions of who to blame for the disease confuse discussions of how to respond to it, in Bonaparte's day, it was just the opposite. He and his propagandists used the disease in the Orient to obscure his crimes and the outcomes of his military campaign. Gros' painting was a smash hit at the Salon. Critics lost themselves in the shadowy recesses of the painting, inspecting the horrific details of the disease and in the unusual costumes and architecture of the Near East. The painting, it would seem, succeeded in substituting the horror of disease and the mystery of the Orient for an investigation of the darker aspects of the expedition. One critic, looking at the canvas, praised Bonaparte for invigorating his soldiers, quote, against an enemy that the French bayonet cannot overcome, suggesting that it was ultimately the plague that had foiled Bonaparte in Egypt. You will recall that President Trump recently referred to the virus as, quote, an invisible enemy, and we will soon have to endure a debate about the extent to which the coronavirus is to be blamed for our economy. Gros' painting exploits disease to bolster Bonaparte's image in still another way, one which I think we are especially able to appreciate now with our current experience of the coronavirus. Elaine Scarry has remarked that pain is isolating because it cannot be shared with others, and that it defies expression in language. Gros, however, had a special talent for giving form to suffering in images. The muscular behemoths ranged across his canvas evoke lethargy and feverish aches only too well. Few painters could use color and modeling as well as Gros to paint flesh with the vitality of life or the pallor of impending death. Accents of red evoke eyes swollen by infection. Facial expressions suggest terror and anguish. Gestures communicate despair. Shadows, alternatively dark or luminous, mark the bulges and cavities of their bodies, lending them an intense physicality. Veins, sinews, muscles, and bone structure are remarkably palpable, eminently carnal. The dreadful symptoms and effects of the disease are all present: contracting limbs, fatigue, delirium, and blindness. Bonaparte's heroism derives from his proximity to these bodies, from his willingness to touch a bubo, to come into intimate contact with a plague-stricken man, to touch him on his tender, red, swollen underarm. He has removed his glove, permitting flesh-to-flesh contact. In contrast to the officer just behind him, he ignores the stench and he looks the diseased man directly in the eyes. The sensuality of his gesture is amplified by the lusciousness of the body he touches, which, if not as sensuous as Michelangelo's dying slave, shares something of its pose, languor, and strapping physique. Bonaparte indulges himself in an action that is normally completely forbidden in the face of contagion. In our present situation, with our unwelcome familiarity with contagion, this gesture seems particularly irrational and foolhardy. As we have seen, however, it had long been celebrated in relation to the plague. The heroism of saints was figured precisely in their willingness to approach the sick, to come into their immediate physical proximity. Sometimes they offered only comfort, sometimes communion, and sometimes they cured the sick, but they always also offered human contact. They did not shun the ill, but sought them out as fellow human beings. Bonaparte's gesture derived meaning from such pictures, as well as from the tradition of the healing king and from depictions of Jesus. Unlike his saintly, royal, and divine predecessors, however, Bonaparte could not really cure them. As everyone knew, and he could not have cared less about saving their souls. He acted as a secular figure with no special powers beyond moral courage and his role as a leader. Gros' painting cited a variety of traditional motifs used to picture disease, jumbling religious, royal, classical, and medical iconographies. But in point of fact, it depicted someone who could not cure the sick and who approached them in order to dispel fear. Perhaps this is what Gros meant when he claimed that Bonaparte's action embodied, quote, a genre of courage unknown until then, and which has since had its imitators. Disease in our own time is most commonly represented through an iconography that is overwhelmingly medical, emphasizing doctors and nurses, hospitals, and technology. But it is also common for politicians to appear with those suffering from disease, or when the danger of infection renders this impossible, with patients who have recovered from disease. Here, for example, is Barack Obama with Nina Pham, a nurse who survived Ebola after contracting it from a patient in Texas in 2014. Obama's embrace signified a nation's gratitude for her medical service, but the image was surely also meant to allay fears about contagion, as rumors of an epidemic of Ebola had been running rampant, and to welcome her back into society after a period of isolation. Obama used his moral authority as a political leader to allay irrational fears about the disease and to emphasize our common humanity. Just before meeting with Pham, Obama shook hands with several other nurses who had treated Ebola victims and said, quote, I want to use myself as an example, just so that people have a sense of the science here. I don't want to draw too tight an analogy between the photograph and the Jaffa. Bonaparte's gesture probably never occurred, and all his actions related to the plague were cynical and self-interested. In Gros' painting, his gesture is meant to conceal atrocities. Today, we look at the picture with the knowledge that Bonaparte was never really held to account for his crackpot medical theories, reckless behavior, lies, and crimes. But the appeal of Gros' picture, which has been great from the time it was painted right down to the present, suggests something about why our current situation is so disturbing. A common image of the coronavirus is of those who have the disease or who are vulnerable to it, unable to touch their loved ones. The disease forces us into social isolation and makes us afraid to come into contact with our fellow human beings. Today, especially, we realize the benefits of a leader who would unite us, who would emphasize the humanity that we share with the rest of the world, and who would help us to mourn our losses. That's all I have. Thanks.